I grew up in Riverbend, a small, peaceful town in Queensland. I had always been fascinated by photography. Growing up in a small town with not much to do, I often found myself wandering the countryside with a camera in hand. It was my escape, my way of making sense of the world. I never really fit in with the sports crowd at school, and though I had a few friends, I mostly preferred solitude. Photography became my passion early on, especially after my uncle, a retired journalist, gifted me my first camera when I was 13. He had always been my role model. My parents, both teachers at the local high school, were always supportive of my interests. I didn't come from a wealthy family, but we were comfortable. My younger sister, Sarah, often teased me about my hobby, calling me the town's paparazzo, but I knew she appreciated the portraits I took of her. We had a close bond, despite the occasional sibling banter. After graduating from high school, I moved to a nearby city to study graphic design and photography. I wasn't the most academically inclined student, but when it came to visual arts, I thrived. I spent hours in the university's darkroom, experimenting with film, light, and composition. Even though digital photography was the norm, I found something special in the old-school techniques of film processing. It felt more tangible, more connected to the moment I captured. After finishing my degree, I returned home, unsure of my next steps. I took up freelance photography work, shooting weddings, events, and the occasional portrait session. It paid the bills, but it didn't fuel the creative spark that drove me. That's when I started exploring abandoned places. There was something about these forgotten spaces, silent remnants of a past life, that drew me in. Capturing them felt like freezing time, preserving the stories that once unfolded there. So when I heard about the old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town, I was excited. It was perfect for my photography project. I gathered my camera and some extra batteries, and I set off. The hospital loomed ahead, its broken windows like empty eyes staring at me. As I stepped inside, a chilly wind whispered through the halls. The walls were covered with peeling paint, and strange shadows danced in the corners. I took a deep breath and started snapping pictures. I captured everything: the crumbling floors, the rusted medical equipment, and the eerie silence. Each click of the camera felt like a new discovery. After a few hours, I decided it was time to head home. I had taken plenty of photos and felt proud of my work. Later that evening, I sat down to develop the pictures. As I carefully placed each photo in the developer, I could hardly contain my excitement. But when I looked closely at one picture, my heart skipped a beat. In the background, just behind a broken bed, was a figure. It looked like a person, but they were blurry and hard to make out. I rubbed my eyes and leaned closer, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But no, there it was, staring straight at the camera. A shiver crawled up my back, leaving a trail of unease. Who is this? I wondered. I decided to take a closer look at the rest of my photos. One by one, I examined them. To my horror, I found the same figure in several other shots. In one, it was by a cracked window. In another, it was standing in the hallway, just out of reach. I felt scared, but also curious. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me. The next day, I returned to the hospital. I wanted to find out more about this mysterious person. As I walked through the dim corridors again, I felt like I was being watched. I snapped more photos, hoping to capture a clearer image of the figure. To my surprise, the figure appeared again in the new pictures. It was as if it was following me, lurking just out of sight. I started noticing the figure in everyday life too, in pictures, in my friends' photos, and even in the reflection of windows. It felt like I couldn't escape it. I showed my friends the pictures. They chuckled at first, thinking it was just a spooky trick of the camera. But when they saw the figure, their faces changed. "That's creepy," one of them said. "You should stop taking photos in that place." Another warned. But I was determined to find answers. I began to research the history of the hospital. I discovered it had been closed for years due to accidents and strange happenings. Many said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered there. The more I read, the more I felt a connection to the figure. I wanted to understand why it kept appearing. I returned to the hospital again, clutching the photos tightly in my hands. I felt brave, but also uneasy. As I stepped inside, I whispered, "Are you here?" I took a few photos, hoping this time to capture a clearer picture. Suddenly, I heard a sound, like a whisper. I froze. It felt cold, like someone was right behind me. I quickly turned around, but no one was there. My heart raced as I aimed my camera towards the shadows. I decided to leave. As I turned to go, I heard the whisper again. Only this time, it sounded like a name I didn't recognize. That night, I developed the new photos. I was shocked to find that the figure was clearer than ever. It was almost as if it were trying to reach out to me. Days passed, and I started having strange dreams. In my dreams, the figure showed me scenes of the hospital's past. I saw doctors and nurses running around and patients waiting for help. One night, I dreamt of the name I had heard, a name that echoed in my mind, Emily. I woke up feeling anxious. Who was Emily? I decided to dig deeper and find out more. I went back to the library and found old newspaper articles. They spoke of a nurse who had worked at the hospital named Emily. She had disappeared after a terrible incident. I couldn't believe it. Could this be the same Emily from my dreams? It all started to connect. I kept digging into Emily's story, piecing together clues from old newspapers and library archives. I found out that Emily had been a nurse at the hospital many years ago. She was kind and always helped everyone, but she had a very difficult time there. One article said there was an accident involving some medicine. Emily had been trying to help a patient who was very sick, but her co-workers, who were supposed to help her, didn't support her. They blamed her for the accident, even though it wasn't her fault. Emily felt very alone and upset. Her co-workers did not believe in her and turned against her. She tried to prove she was right, but no one listened. She was so sad and hurt that she left the hospital and never came back. As I read more, I realized that Emily didn't die in the hospital, but she was betrayed and brokenhearted because of how she was treated. The article suggested that she left town, but no one knew where she went. It all started to make sense. The figure I kept seeing in the photos was Emily's spirit. She was still wandering around the hospital, maybe looking for someone to tell her story or find out what happened to her. Feeling a bit of peace, I decided to take one last trip to the hospital. I went there and whispered, "Emily, I know what happened. I'm sorry." I hoped she could finally find some rest now that her story was known. That night, I felt calm and slept well for the first time in weeks. I knew that Emily's story had been heard, and maybe now she could finally move on.